Petra Voss came home 2 hours early on a Tuesday afternoon, and the laptop was open, and the subject line was right there on the screen, and Petra Voss, whatever else you might say about her, was never the kind of woman who looked away from something that didn't add up. She was 43 years old. She had been married to Grant Holloway for 11 years. He was the CEO of a healthcare logistics company called Vantage Group Solutions, headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. They lived in a high-rise in Buckhead, the kind of address that told you everything and nothing at the same time. She had been a corporate fraud attorney before they married. She had given up that practice, quietly, in the way that certain women of a certain social tier give up certain things, not because anyone asked her to, but because the life she was building seemed to require it. She had not stopped being sharp. She had only stopped being paid for it. And on that Tuesday afternoon in March, that distinction was about to matter more than it ever had. By the time she reached the bottom of the email thread, 61 messages, going back 19 months, she understood three things with a clarity that surprised even her. The first was that her husband, Grant Holloway, had been deceiving her for the better part of 2 years. Not the ordinary small deceits of a long marriage, but something structural, deliberate, and layered with the kind of legal exposure that ends careers and begins prison sentences. The second was that he had not been working alone. And the third, the one that would stay with her longest, was that he had written about her in those emails. He had discussed her. He had weighed her. And he had decided that the safest thing to do with Petra Voss was to keep her comfortable and keep her out of it. She finished reading. She closed the laptop. She went to the stove and started making dinner. And in the 40 minutes before Grant Holloway walked through the front door, she made a decision that would change the outcome of everything. What was in those emails? Who else was involved? And why, after reading something that would have sent most people running for a phone or a door, did she make dinner? Stay with us. Because this story is not about a woman who fell apart. This is a story about a woman who had been underestimated by the one person who should have known better. And what she did next is something I promise you will not forget. To understand what Petra found on that laptop, you need to understand the four people at the center of this story. The first is Petra herself. We will get there. The second is Grant Holloway. Grant was 51 years old at the time of these events. He had built Vantage Group Solutions over 14 years from a two-person consulting outfit in a Marietta strip mall into a company doing north of $300 million a year in government-contracted healthcare logistics. He was on the boards of 2 Atlanta nonprofits. He had been profiled in Georgia Trend magazine. He was charming in the way that certain executives are charming, not warm exactly, but present. The kind of man who made you feel like the most important person in the room while he was talking to you, and who you later realized you could not quite remember the eyes of. The third person is Diane Weston. She was Vantage's chief financial officer, had been with the company for 7 years, and was the name that appeared at the bottom of most of the emails Petra read that afternoon. And the fourth, the one who is hardest to place in a simple category, is a man named Tanner Brock. A private equity investor. A silent board member. A name that appeared in those emails in the way that names appear when someone wants credit without consequence. Here are the questions this story has to answer. First, what exactly had Grant Holloway been doing inside Vantage Group Solutions for 19 months, and how deep did it go? Second, was Diane Weston a willing partner in this, or had she been put in a position where she felt she had no choice? Third, who was Tanner Brock really, and what did his involvement mean for the people who had no idea he existed? And fourth, and this is the one that will keep coming back to you, what does it mean that Petra read all of it, processed all of it, and then made pasta? These are not easy questions. Some of them have clean answers. Some of them have answers that depend entirely on where you are standing when you look at the facts. But all of them lead to the same place, a federal courtroom, a plea agreement, and a woman who walked back into a law office for the first time in 9 years and hung her degree back on the wall. Before we go any further, we would love to know where you are watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments right now. We read every single one. And if you have not already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Now, let us get back to Petra. Petra Voss grew up in Columbus, Ohio. Her father was a public school administrator and her mother kept the books for 3 small businesses in their neighborhood, including a dry cleaner and a hardware store. She would later say that watching her mother work, that particular combination of trust and precision, the way people handed over their finances and expected accuracy and got it, was the first time she understood what it meant to be someone that people relied on. She was the first person in her immediate family to get a graduate degree. She went to law school at Emory, graduated in the top 8% of her class, and took a position at a mid-size Atlanta firm specializing in financial litigation. Within 4 years she was handling corporate fraud cases. She was, by every account from people who worked with her, exceptional at reading the architecture of a lie, at understanding not just what the numbers said but what shape the deception had taken, where the pressure points were, and who was most afraid of which particular truth. She met Grant Holloway at an Atlanta Bar Association event in 2012. She was 32. He was 40. He asked her what kind of law she practiced, and when she told him corporate fraud litigation, he laughed, the short, surprised laugh of a man who found something genuinely funny, and said, "Then I'll make sure never to get on your bad side." She thought it was a throwaway line. It was not. It was the most accurate thing he ever said to her. They dated for 14 months. They married in 2013 at a small ceremony in Savannah. She left her firm the following year. The arrangement was never stated explicitly, it was not that kind of marriage, but it settled into place the way those arrangements do, through accumulation, through the slow logic of 2 careers that could not both expand in the same direction at the same time. Grant's company needed him fully present. Petra's career needed the same. One of them stepped back. These things happen in marriages. The weight of that decision would not become visible for years. Grant Holloway was, in many respects, a genuinely impressive person. That is not a small thing to say about someone who ends up in a story like this, and it is important to say it clearly before we go further, because the temptation in these kinds of stories is to build the central figure into a cartoon villain from the beginning, to find the small early signs that he was always going to be this person. The truth is more complicated than that. Grant had built something real. Vantage Group Solutions, at its best, was a company that helped regional hospital networks manage supply chains and vendor contracts more efficiently. In a healthcare system that wastes billions of dollars annually on logistical inefficiency, that is not nothing. He had hired good people. He had made payroll through 2 economic downturns. He had expanded from Georgia into 6 states without over-leveraging the company. His employees, for the most part, believed in what they were doing. The version of Grant Holloway that existed before the emails began was a version that would have been hard to indict. And then Tanner Brock came into the picture. The timing matters. It was 2021. The healthcare logistics sector was attracting serious private equity attention in the wake of the pandemic. Companies that had spent 2 years demonstrating their necessity to hospital systems suddenly looked like undervalued assets to people who moved money at scale. Tanner Brock was a managing partner at a private investment group called Harrow Capital, based in Houston. He reached out to Grant directly, not through an investment bank, not through a formal process, but through a mutual contact at a golf event in Hilton Head. He had, he said, been watching Vantage for 2 years. He wanted to talk about what a strategic capital injection might look like. Grant agreed to meet. And that meeting, by every reasonable reconstruction of events, is where the 19 months captured in those emails began. Diane Weston had been Vantage's CFO for 7 of her 17 years in corporate finance. She was 46. She had an MBA from Georgia State and had spent a decade in the unglamorous trenches of healthcare billing and compliance before joining Vantage in the period when Grant was scaling the company most aggressively. People who worked alongside her described someone exacting, methodical, and professionally guarded, the kind of person who answered questions with precision and never gave you more than you asked for. She was competent in a way that quietly made everything around her work better. Her name appeared on every major contract Vantage had executed in 7 years. She knew where every dollar came from and where it went. That knowledge, as it turned out, was both her greatest value and her greatest vulnerability in what was coming. What Petra found in the email suggested that Diane Weston had not initiated the arrangement. The earliest messages were between Grant and Tanner Brock exclusively, and the picture they painted was of a plan that already had its architecture before Diane was brought into it. By the time she appears in the thread, around the 4th month of messages, she is already inside something she clearly understood, asking pointed questions about documentation and compliance exposure, and receiving answers that were either reassuring or deliberately vague, depending on how you read Grant's tone. Whether Diane Weston had the ability to walk away from what she was being asked to do, and whether she tried, these are questions the federal investigation would spend considerable time on. Tanner Brock is the most difficult figure in this story to place, because he was designed to be. He was 58. He had navigated the edges of financial regulation for long enough to know exactly how to stay just inside them, or just close enough to the line that proving otherwise required resources most investigations do not have. Harrow Capital had a legitimate portfolio. It had real companies, real returns, real institutional investors. Tanner Brock was not, in the surface picture, a disreputable person. He gave to causes. He had a family. He appeared at the kinds of industry events where appearance is the currency. The deeper picture, the one that began to emerge as the federal investigation developed, was of a man who had made a practice of finding executives in companies with government contract exposure and offering them a specific kind of help that was also a specific kind of trap. He did not do anything crude. He did not threaten anyone. He offered money, relationships, and the quiet confidence of a man who had done this before. What he asked for in return was access. And access, in the healthcare contracting world, meant something very precise and very federal. By the time Petra sat down at that laptop, Tanner Brock had been in Grant Holloway's orbit for 19 months. And in that time, the company Grant had spent 14 years building had become something he would not have recognized at the start. It was a Thursday in March. Petra had been at a lunch with a friend that ended earlier than expected. She came home to their Buckhead high-rise at 4:47 in the afternoon. Grant was not home, he rarely was before 7. She walked into the kitchen, set down her bag, saw the MacBook open on the island, and the first thing she noticed was not what was on the screen but that it was on at all. Grant was meticulous about his devices. He locked everything. He had the kind of instinctive operational security that people develop when they are carrying things they do not want found. She had remarked on it once, not suspiciously, just as an observation about habit, and he had laughed and said old professional instinct. The laptop being open and unlocked was not nothing. She took a step closer. She read the subject line. It said, Harrow Distribution, Final Trench Confirmation, Do Not Forward. She told herself later that she nearly closed it. That the reasonable thing would have been to step back, acknowledge it was not hers to read, and wait. She knew she did not do the reasonable thing. She pulled out the stool. She sat down. She started at the top of the thread and she read every single message in sequence. The thread began 19 months earlier, in August of the prior year. The first email was from Grant to Tanner Brock and was written in the shorthand of two people who had already spoken at length about the thing they were putting into writing. There was no explanation, no context, no covering of ground. It assumed a shared understanding. It discussed what it called the pass-through arrangement, a structure in which Vantage Group Solutions would route a portion of its government healthcare contract payments through a subsidiary entity that had no operational purpose, which would then transfer those funds to an account connected to Harrow Capital's offshore holdings. In exchange, Harrow Capital would provide what the email called introductory facilitation services for two pending federal contract renewals in Georgia and Tennessee. In plain language, Vantage would pay Tanner Brock's organization through a shell company, and Brock would use his connections to help secure the renewal of government contracts worth a combined $51 million. That is bribery of a public official run through a private financial structure. That is a federal crime. Petra read that first email twice. She would later describe the feeling not as shock but as a kind of geometric clarity, the way a complicated image resolves into a shape you recognize. She had spent years in corporate fraud litigation. She knew exactly what she was reading. She also knew, in reading that first message, that it had already been going on for 19 months. The first email was not a proposal. It was a confirmation that the thing was in motion. She kept reading. By the 20th email, roughly 6 months into the thread, the scope had expanded. It was no longer 2 federal contract renewals. There was discussion of a 3rd contract in North Carolina and a 4th in Virginia. The North Carolina contract involved a regional hospital network called Baxter Health Collaborative, a legitimate, community-serving organization that had no idea it was part of this arrangement. The emails discussed it as a line item. A number. A vehicle. Baxter Health Collaborative had 14 partner clinics serving rural and underinsured populations across the western part of the state. The emails referred to it, in one exchange, as the NC vehicle. Nothing more. The people it served did not appear anywhere in the thread. This is the part of the story where the true damage of white-collar fraud becomes visible, and it is worth pausing here, because these stories often focus exclusively on the executives and the money and the courtroom, and what gets lost is the thing underneath. Vantage Group Solutions, as it was directing portions of its government contract revenue into a pass-through structure for Tanner Brock, was simultaneously underbidding on service delivery. The math required it. The money had to come from somewhere. Several of the hospital networks it contracted with in this period reported service delivery issues, delayed shipments, reduced vendor responsiveness, contract terms that seemed to drift from what had been promised. One of those networks, a small system in eastern Tennessee, was forced to absorb a $500,000 shortfall in medical supply delivery in a single quarter. They borrowed to cover it. Their patients never knew why. And then, in email 43, Petra found something that had nothing to do with contracts or offshore structures. She found her own name. The email was from Diane Weston to Grant. It was sent 14 months into the thread. It was 3 sentences long. Diane wrote, "Grant, I need to flag something." I pulled the Q3 summary and there is a line item under International Advisory that does not reconcile with anything in our standard filings. If Petra sees this, and I understand she still reviews your personal tax documents, she will know what it is. She was a fraud attorney. She will know exactly what it is. I need to know how you are handling that. Grant replied 11 minutes later. He wrote, "Petra does not review anything related to the company. That was decided a long time ago. She is not a concern." Diane replied, "Understood. Just needed to hear it." Petra read that exchange 4 times. Not because she did not understand it the first time, she understood it perfectly on the first read. She read it 4 times because of a specific phrase. That was decided a long time ago. Not she does not have access. Not she would not recognize it. She is not a concern. He had not underestimated her accidentally. He had made a deliberate assessment, had looked at his wife, the woman who had spent a decade litigating the exact type of fraud he was committing, and concluded that she was not a concern. He had decided she was manageable. That the version of Petra Voss who existed inside their marriage was not the same person as the attorney who used to walk into deposition rooms and dismantle people. He was not entirely wrong about that. But he was wrong about enough of it that it was going to cost him everything. She read the last message in the thread. It was from 3 weeks prior, and it confirmed what she already understood: the 4th contract, the Virginia one, had been formally awarded. Vantage Group Solutions was now embedded in 4 separate government contract arrangements that had been influenced, directly or indirectly, by a payment structure that no compliance officer, no auditor, and no regulator had been shown. She sat for what she described later as a long time, though she thinks it was probably 4 or 5 minutes. She looked at her hands. She looked at the kitchen, the custom cabinetry, the marble countertops, the very expensive, very beautiful space that had been purchased, in part, with money that should not have existed. Then she got up. She turned on the stove. She filled a pot with water. She started making dinner. Grant would be home in 43 minutes. Grant came home at 7:12. He was carrying his jacket over one arm and his phone in his hand, the posture of a man completing a day that had not quite finished yet. He walked into the kitchen, saw Petra at the stove, and said what he always said, "How was your day?" She told him it was fine. She told him she had run into a friend at lunch and come home early. She asked about his. He talked about a board call and a vendor issue in Tennessee. She listened and responded at the right moments and poured him a glass of wine and served the pasta. He ate at the island. She sat across from him. They talked about a trip they were vaguely planning. He mentioned a charity event the following week. At no point, by any observable measure, did the evening deviate from the established patterns of their shared life. She did this not because she had no feelings about what she had read. She did it because she had already decided something, and the decision required that he not know she had decided it. What she had understood, sitting at that stove in those 43 minutes, was this: she had two possible paths, and they led to very different outcomes, not just for her, but for people she did not know and would never meet. The first path was the private one. She could take what she knew to a divorce attorney, use it as leverage in a settlement negotiation, and walk away with financial security and the quiet knowledge that she had protected herself. Grant's lawyers were exceptionally good. In a private negotiation, there was a real possibility that the legal exposure from the emails would be managed, reduced, contained, explained away by people who were paid very well to do exactly that. Diane Weston might take a fall. Tanner Brock, with his expensive attorneys and his offshore structures and his career of staying just inside the line, would almost certainly walk away intact. The hospital networks in Tennessee and North Carolina and Virginia would never know what had been done in the margins of the contracts that served them. The second path required something different from Petra. She did not move quickly. That is one of the most remarkable things about what followed, and it is worth sitting with, because the instinct in a moment like this is to act, to call someone, to do something, to release the pressure of what you know by converting it into motion. Petra did the opposite. For the first 11 days after finding the emails, she continued her life as it appeared on the surface. She attended the charity event with Grant. She had dinner with friends. She was present and engaged and gave nothing away. What she was doing, during this period, was thinking. She was reconstructing the architecture of the fraud from memory. She had not photographed the emails on the day she found them, a decision that speaks to both her discipline and the particular challenge of her position, and she was identifying what she needed to verify before she could take any step that could not be taken back. On day 12, she drove to a FedEx office in Midtown, used a computer she had not touched before, and began pulling public records. SEC filings for Vantage Group Solutions. Federal Contract Award databases, these are public, accessible to anyone who knows where to look. State business registration records for the subsidiary entity whose name had appeared in the emails. She found it in Delaware, a state that has been used as a vehicle for shell company registrations for decades precisely because its disclosure requirements are minimal. The entity was called Harrow Logistics Advisory LLC. It had been registered 14 months earlier. It had no website, no employees, no physical address beyond a registered agent. Its listed purpose was healthcare logistics consulting. It had received, in its 14 months of existence, wire transfers totaling just over $8 million from entities she could trace back to Vantage's government contract payments. $8 million. 14 months. And not a single person inside Vantage's compliance structure had flagged it. Or if they had been persuaded not to pursue it. On day 16, she reached out to a former colleague from her years at the firm, a man named Victor Hollins, who had left corporate litigation to become a forensic accountant and worked primarily on federal fraud investigations. She did not call him from her home phone or her personal cell. She reached him through a secure message through a mutual professional contact, asking if he had time to look at something. They met at a coffee shop in Decatur. She brought a printed summary, not the emails themselves, but a reconstruction of the structure she had identified from public records, and she laid it on the table and asked him one question: "Is this what I think it is?" Victor Hollins looked at it for approximately 4 minutes without speaking. Then he looked up and said, "Petra. This is not just civil. This is federal. Multiple counts. If this is what these records suggest, there are at least 2 people in this who are looking at wire fraud, conspiracy, and potentially bribery of a public official." She told him she thought she knew where the documentation was. He told her she needed a lawyer before she did anything else. She told him she was a lawyer. He said, "You need one who is not also the subject's wife." Here is something that Petra did not know when she sat down at that laptop, and would not know for another 3 weeks. She was not the only person who had been looking. The United States Department of Justice, through its Southern District of Georgia office, had opened a preliminary inquiry into Vantage Group Solutions 8 months earlier. The inquiry had been triggered by a routine audit flag on one of the federal contract renewals, a discrepancy in the pass-through accounting that a compliance analyst at the Department of Health and Human Services had noticed and referred upward. The DOJ inquiry was being handled quietly, the way preliminary inquiries are handled before there is enough to move on, building documentation, identifying witnesses, mapping the financial structure. The lead attorney on the inquiry was a federal prosecutor named Simone Dre. She was thorough, methodical, and, as she would later describe it, about 3 months away from having what she needed to move from inquiry to active investigation. What Simone Dre did not have, in those 3 months before Petra walked through her office door, was the email thread. She had the financial records, the shell company registrations, the contract award history. What she did not have was the internal communications that showed the intent, the explicit planning, the deliberate structuring, the awareness at the highest levels of Vantage that what they were doing was not legal. Intent is everything in federal fraud prosecution. You can build a circumstantial case from financial records alone, and sometimes you can win it. But you win faster, and you win cleaner, and you win in a way that accounts for all the people who should be held responsible, when you have the emails. As Petra continued her reconstruction of the public record, she found something in the federal contract award history that stopped her. In the period 18 months earlier, just before the thread began, there had been another company bidding on the same Tennessee and Georgia contract renewals that Vantage ultimately won. The company was called Ridgeline Health Partners. It was a small firm out of Knoxville, family-operated, with a solid track record in healthcare logistics for regional systems. Their bid on the Tennessee contract, by the public scoring records, was competitive, arguably stronger on the service delivery metrics. They did not get the contract. 3 months after losing the bid, they lost their 2 largest existing clients with no public explanation. 6 months after that, they filed for bankruptcy. The owner, a man named Aaron Ridgeline, yes, the company was named after his family, had spoken to a regional business journal at the time and said only that they had encountered a pattern of interference we could not explain and could not afford to fight. The journal ran 2 paragraphs on it. Nobody followed up. Petra found that article at 11:30 at night, in her home office, with Grant asleep down the hall. She read it twice. Then she sat very still for a long time. A family company. Competitive bid. Gone. And in the emails she had read, in the part of the thread that covered the same period, there was a single line, Grant to Tanner Brock, that said, "The Knoxville situation has resolved. We are clear." She had not known what the Knoxville situation was when she first read it. Now she did. A legitimate company had been pushed out of its market, its clients had disappeared, its family had lost everything they built, and it had been described in one line of one email as a situation that had resolved. Petra printed that journal article. She put it in the folder she was building. On day 23, she called Victor Hollins again and told him she was ready to talk to someone at the DOJ. He gave her a contact name. She called from her car on a Wednesday afternoon, parked in the lot of a grocery store she did not usually shop at, because she had started being careful in the way that people who have thought clearly about their circumstances become careful. The call lasted 7 minutes. She identified herself, identified Grant and Vantage Group Solutions, and said she had documentation of a federal fraud scheme involving government healthcare contract manipulation and offshore payment structures. There was a pause on the other end. The person she had reached asked her one question: how did she have access to this information? She said, "I am his wife. And I used to be a corporate fraud attorney." And he forgot to close his laptop. They scheduled a meeting for the following Tuesday. Simone Dre described the Tuesday meeting in terms that are unusual for a federal prosecutor, who by professional habit tends toward the restrained and procedural. She said it was one of the most striking meetings she had conducted in 14 years of federal practice. Not because of what Petra had, though what Petra had was significant, but because of how she had organized it. Petra arrived at the federal building with a 42-page document. Not the emails themselves, she had not photographed them on the day she found them. What she had was a reconstruction, a precise account of the email thread's contents from memory, cross-referenced with the public financial records she had pulled, the shell company registrations, the federal contract award history, the timeline of Ridgeline Health Partners collapse, and a structural diagram of the pass-through arrangement as she had understood it from the thread. It was annotated. It had source citations. It had tabs. Simone Dre later said that the document identified 3 financial entities her team had not yet located, and a timeline discrepancy in the contract award sequence that her investigators had flagged but not yet connected to the Harrow capital structure. The meeting lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, Simone Dre asked Petra directly, could she obtain access to the emails themselves? Petra said she did not know. She said that the laptop had been opened once and had not been opened since. Simone Dre said they would need to address that through proper legal channels, a warrant, a subpoena, the standard instruments of a federal investigation that had now, as of this Tuesday meeting, formally escalated from inquiry to active investigation. Petra understood. She also understood something she did not say in that room: she had not come to the DOJ because she was required to. She had come because Aaron Ridgeline had lost his company and his employees had lost their jobs and rural patients in Tennessee had been shorted on medical supplies, and all of it had been described in one line of one email as a situation that had resolved. Now here is where this story takes a turn that even people who knew Petra well did not see coming. Because what Petra brought to that meeting was not just a 42-page document. What she brought was something that the federal investigation, in 8 months of careful quiet work, had not been able to establish: the knowledge that Tanner Brock was not simply a passive beneficiary of the arrangement. In email 57 of the 61 she had read, she remembered it precisely, the way attorneys remember critical passages of documents that matter. Tanner Brock had written directly to Grant. He had written, "I need to discuss the 4th contract. I have a different connection for Virginia than we used for Tennessee. Cleaner, newer, and not someone who will be on anyone's radar for the next 18 months. I will need Vantage to structure a separate consulting agreement, separate entity, not linked to the Harrow structure. This one we document as strategic advisory. The fee will be $450,000. Grant had replied, "Understood. Diane will structure it." Diane had replied to both of them, "I need this in writing from Tanner confirming the scope. I will not execute this without documentation that establishes his deliverables." That exchange established something crucial. It established that Tanner Brock was not a passive investor who had received the benefits of an arrangement Grant and Diane had designed. He was an active architect. He had identified the government officials. He had structured the payment vehicles. He had specified the fees and the documentation. He was, in the language of federal law, a principal in the conspiracy. Without that email exchange, Tanner Brock, with his Houston attorneys and his career of staying just inside the line, might very well have been positioned as a recipient of improperly routed funds, subject to civil penalties, managed through his legal team, and walked largely clear of criminal exposure. With that exchange, the picture changed entirely. Simone Dre, when Petra described that specific exchange from memory, stopped writing. She asked Petra to repeat it. Petra repeated it, word for word. Dre wrote it down, underlined it, and said, that changes the scope of this significantly. As the federal investigation moved from its preliminary stage to active status, now with Petra's reconstruction as a foundation, investigators began interviewing former Vantage employees. What they found, in those interviews, was a pattern that preceded Petra's discovery by more than a year. A former senior analyst at Vantage named Marcus Webb had been employed in the Financial Operations Division from 2019 to 2022. In the summer of 2022, Webb had flagged an internal discrepancy, the same type of reconciliation issue that had initially caught the attention of the HHS compliance analyst, but from the inside. He had brought it to his direct supervisor, then to the compliance officer, and had been told each time that it was a legacy accounting classification issue that was in the process of being corrected. 3 months later, Webb's performance reviews took a sharp turn. He received 2 formal warnings in a period of 6 weeks, warnings that his colleagues, interviewed separately, described as inconsistent with their knowledge of his work. He was eventually presented with a choice between termination and a quiet exit with severance and a non-disclosure agreement. Webb had signed the NDA. He had taken the settlement. He had spent the following year trying to convince himself that he had been wrong about what he saw. When federal investigators reached him, he had been out of the company for nearly 18 months. He was working as a financial analyst for a mid-size manufacturing company in suburban Atlanta. He was 33 years old. He had developed a medical condition, stress-related, his doctor had noted at the time, that had required treatment during the period of his departure from Vantage. He was not angry, exactly, when investigators came to him. He was something more specific than anger. He was relieved. The relief of a person who has spent a long time holding the weight of something alone and suddenly finds that the weight is going to be shared. The federal search warrant was executed on a Thursday morning in November. 2 agents arrived at the Vantage Group Solutions headquarters in Atlanta at 9:15 in the morning. Grant Holloway was in a meeting. His assistant interrupted it. She would later describe his expression when she told him as something she had never seen on him before, not fear exactly, and not surprise exactly, but the look of a man watching a structure he believed to be permanent reveal, in one moment, that it had always been temporary. His first call from the conference room where they asked him to wait was to his attorney. His second call, made 11 minutes later, from the same room, while the agent stood by, was to Petra. She picked up on the second ring. She was at a coffee shop near their building. He asked her one question. He said, "Did you go to them?" She was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, "I will have dinner ready at 7 if you are home." She ended the call. She set her phone face down on the table. She finished her coffee. She did not cry. She had done her crying 3 weeks earlier, in the car, in the parking lot of a grocery store she did not shop at, where she had sat for 20 minutes after scheduling the Tuesday meeting before she felt steady enough to drive home. Grant Holloway pled guilty to 2 counts of federal wire fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit bribery of a public official. He was sentenced to 51 months in federal prison. He was ordered to pay restitution of $11.2 million, a number that represented the government's assessment of the total financial benefit derived from the manipulation of the 4 contract awards. Diane Weston cooperated with federal prosecutors. Her cooperation was substantial and credible, and included documentation that the DOJ had not possessed, specifically, records she had retained in a personal file outside the company's systems, which she described as something she had kept because she had not been certain, for the past several months, that she was going to be able to trust the people around her. Her sentence was reduced as a result of her cooperation. She was sentenced to 18 months of supervised release and ordered to pay a financial penalty. She did not serve prison time. Whether that outcome is just, whether a person who executes a fraud scheme at the level Diane Weston did deserves a substantially lighter consequence because she cooperated, is a question people who followed the case argued about at considerable length. Tanner Brock's case was more protracted, as cases involving people with expensive legal teams and carefully structured financial arrangements tend to be. His initial attorneys argued that his involvement was passive, that the payments to Harrow Capital were legitimate consulting fees, that he had no knowledge of the mechanism by which the contract awards were influenced. That argument held less weight after federal investigators, working from the framework Petra had reconstructed and the specific email exchange she had described from memory, subpoenaed the actual email records and found email 57 exactly as she had described it. Tanner Brock eventually pled guilty to one count of conspiracy. His sentence was 30 months. He served 22. He was also ordered to forfeit $6.8 million in assets. He did not lose most of his money. He did not lose his house in Houston. He did not lose the kind of structural wealth that survives a legal consequence because it was built at sufficient remove from the specific thing you were convicted of. This is how these things often end. Calling it justice requires a fairly elastic definition of the word. Aaron Ridgeline was contacted by federal investigators as part of the case. His account of what had happened to Ridgeline Health Partners, the sudden client cancellations, the unexplained loss of the contract, the interference he had described to the Regional Business Journal as something he could not explain and could not afford to fight, was documented in the case record. In the civil proceedings that followed the criminal convictions, Ridgeline Health Partners was identified as a damaged party. Aaron Ridgeline received a civil settlement. The amount was not disclosed. When a reporter from an Atlanta business publication asked him about it, he said that it did not represent what the company had been worth, what the employees had lost, or the 3 years he had spent rebuilding something smaller from a position of significantly less leverage. He said he was grateful for the acknowledgement. He said grateful was not the same as whole. Petra Voss filed for divorce from Grant Holloway in the month following the federal charges. The divorce was finalized 14 months later. She did not give press interviews. She did not speak publicly about any aspect of the case. She did something in the months following that people who knew her had not anticipated. She went back to the State Bar of Georgia, completed the reinstatement process for her law license, and returned to practice. Not at her old firm, she joined a smaller group that specialized in whistleblower representation, specifically corporate whistleblowers who had been pushed out of companies through the same playbook that had been used on Marcus Webb. The silencing through HR manipulation playbook. The manufactured performance review playbook. She knew that playbook in two directions now, from the outside, from her years of litigation, and from the inside, from 11 years of watching a man build a professional infrastructure while managing the people around him like variables in an equation. She has, in the time since returning to practice, represented several individuals in federal whistleblower proceedings. She does not discuss these cases publicly. She gave a single on-the-record comment to one reporter who had been covering the case persistently and professionally. She said, "I did what the situation required. I would do it again. There is nothing interesting about that." The reporter asked if she thought Grant had ever expected that she would be the one to bring the case down. She considered the question for a moment. She said, "He thought I was not a concern. That is all I will say about it." There is something that stays with you after you spend time in this story, and I want to name it directly because I think it is the real reason we tell stories like this one. The fraud that Grant Holloway and Diane Weston and Tanner Brock ran through Vantage Group Solutions was not, in the taxonomy of American corporate crime, the largest case ever prosecuted. It was not the most complex. It did not involve thousands of victims in the way that some of the great financial frauds of the past generation did. It was, in scale, a mid-size case. A capable federal prosecutor, a cooperating witness, a relatively clean paper trail, an eventual guilty plea. The kind of case that gets a few days of coverage in the regional business press and then recedes. What makes it worth telling is not its scale. What makes it worth telling is what happened in a kitchen in Buckhead, on a Tuesday afternoon, when a woman who had been told she was not a concern sat down at a laptop and decided to disagree. There are a lot of people in this world who find things out. Who see the thing that does not add up, feel the discomfort of knowledge they were not supposed to have, and make the calculation that the personal cost of acting is higher than the personal cost of looking away. That calculation is not cowardice. Sometimes it is entirely reasonable. Sometimes the math is genuinely that hard. But sometimes the math is actually not that hard, and what we are really calculating is whether the people who would benefit from our action, the Aaron Ridgelines, the Marcus Webbs, the patients in eastern Tennessee, are real enough to us to tip the balance. Petra made that calculation on a Tuesday afternoon with pasta on the stove. She decided they were real. She acted accordingly. And when it was over, she said it was nothing interesting. Just what the situation required. I disagree with her about whether it is interesting. But I think she is right about the other part. I think she would do it again. The question I want to leave you with tonight is this: you have been in situations, maybe not as dramatic as this one, where you found out something you were not supposed to know. Where acting meant cost, and not acting meant someone else paid instead. What did you do? What would you do? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. And while you are down there, tell us where in the world you are watching from. We have viewers from every corner of this country and far beyond it, and every single city and town in those comments makes this community what it is. If you are not yet subscribed to this channel, please do that now. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. We are working on something right now that is every bit as layered and unexpected as what you just watched. I will see you in the next one.